and welcome to our broadcast. On today's show, we have decided to focus only on the Cold War that is ongoing between us and the Soviet Union. We'll be bringing you all the information and analysis that you need to know through interviews and other documents. By the end, we hope we can help explain the Cold War and how we can see it affecting our country. First, I'd like to give a short overview of the war. These tensions between America and the Soviet Union began escalating right after World War II ended. We, as a democracy, found it difficult to reconcile with a communist country. Over the past 15 years or so, we have been trying to lessen the influence of the Soviet Union and the threat it could pose to us and the rest of the world. Now, let's begin our broadcast by showing a recent interview that was done with former President Truman that enforces America's paranoia of communism that was prevalent during his presidency.
Thank you for joining us, President Truman.
Thanks for having me.
American policy on communism after World War I was a policy of containment. Can you please explain what this policy is?
Policy of containment means that the U.S. would not try to actively eliminate communism, but would simply try and contain communism to where it already existed.
What was the main goal behind this containment policy?
The goal of containment was to keep the communism and Soviet regime from spreading beyond Eastern Europe and into the Middle East or Western Europe.
How did the Truman Doctrine, which you issued in 1947, fulfill America's containment policy?
The Truman Doctrine called upon Congress to support the Greek government in its civil war against the Greek Communist Party, and thus prevent the communists from prevailing in the Greek Civil War and consequently allowing Soviets to influence Greek policy. Soviet influence in this region would have included Communist Party, so the United States aimed the Germans as well as Turkey in order to promote containment policy.
Just as the Truman Doctrine worked to prevent Soviet influence in Europe, was a Marshall Plan created with the same intent?
Yes, precisely. 16 nations, including Germany, became part of Marshall Plan, and thus European nations received nearly $13 billion in aid from the United States, which initially resulted in shipments of food, staples, fuel, and machinery. Marshall Plan nations were assisted greatly in their economic recovery, and thus unprecedentedly economic growth was necessary for war-torn European economies to rebuild themselves and fight against Soviet influences.
However, the U.S. did not only help out in Europe during your presidency. UN forces had a strong presence in East Asia as well, specifically in the South Korean region. Can you explain why the U.S. chose to get involved in the Korean conflict?
In Korea, the country had been divided since the end of World War II. The Soviets had occupied North Korea and set up Stalinist and communist government. In 1950, when North Korea troops invaded South Korea, the U.S. stuck by containment and went to war to support South Korea.
So in terms of the Korean War, by the policy of containment, would this mean that communism could stay in North Korea but move no farther?
Yes, exactly. And this was made sure by having the United States help organize Western-like government in South Korea. The peace agreement reached 3 years after the war had started to keep Korea divided and the original border established in the end of the World War II. A demilitarized zone of about 2.5 miles long, the 34th parallel separated the two forces as well.
So based on American communist policy and outcome of the war, would you agree that the Korean War was a successful operation for the U.S.?
Yes, because the U.S. involvement in Korean War was successfully in preventing South Korea from being communist and keeping communists contained. Not only to North Korea, the Korean War was successfully operation that abated by the containment policy.
It is increasingly evident how crucial the containment policy was during your presidency and how it was the driving force in many of your decisions. Thank you for your time, President Truman.
Thank you.
Here we have a political cartoon representing the Iron Curtain across Europe. The Iron Curtain is a term coined by Winston Churchill to describe Joseph Stalin's effort to keep the Soviet Union and communist Eastern Europe from having any contact with the non-communist nations of Western Europe. The one exception to the Iron Curtain, and a cause of rising tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, was Berlin. Berlin itself was divided into West Berlin, which was supported by the Allies, and East Berlin, which was under the Soviet Union's domain. Stalin resented the Allies' political unification of West Germany. As a result, he instituted the Berlin blockade. He stopped all traffic into West Berlin and cut electricity to that part of the city. He hoped the Allies would either give up Berlin or stop trying to unify West Germany. Instead, Truman began a huge airlift to bring supplies to West Berlin. Allied air forces brought planes from around the world and flew supplies and food into West Berlin. Eventually, the Soviets lifted the blockade. Truman's success with the Berlin blockade was also the result of an incredibly successful bluff. To ensure that the Soviets would not shoot down Allied planes and provoke another war, Truman gave them an atomic threat. He claimed that every U.S. plane was carrying an atomic bomb, and if any of them were shot down, the United States would destroy the Soviet Union. This was entirely false, but Stalin did not want another war either, and the planes were able to deliver supplies to West Berlin. One important result of the Berlin blockade and the continually rising tensions between America and the Soviet Union was the creation of alliances like NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance between governments. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed by 12 countries originally and pledged that any attack against a member would be considered an attack against all members. Now we move to how we've been dealing with communism at home. Communism has been a real presence in the world since 1917 and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. But in recent years, our fear of communism spreading has grown into what people are calling a second Red Scare. This started because of the Korean War, a communist country invading a non-communist country. To learn more about fighting communism at home, we're going to play a clip of an interview with former Senator Joseph McCarthy that was filmed some years ago.
Welcome, Senator McCarthy.
Glad to be here.
Senator, people are calling your philosophy and campaign McCarthyism. Could you give us a brief description of this philosophy?
Well, my philosophy is just vehemently anti-communist. I believe that communism is a serious threat to the democracy of the Western world, and we've got to be vigilant about tracking it down. Communists have already infiltrated parts of the State Department.
You say you're investigating members of the State Department. Have you found any traces of communist activity?
Well, not yet, I haven't, but communists are extremely good hiders, so all you've got to do is be patient. The House of Un-American Activities has also made accusations about communist subversives in the government, and that's a pretty credible source since it's meant to investigate all this sort of stuff.
President Truman has taken measures to halt the influence of communism, like installing the Federal Civil Defense Administration. How effective are these measures?
Well, the FCDA distributes information about communism, and it is important to educate people about why it's dangerous. I commend President Truman for making an effort, but we can't afford to be soft on communism. For example, President Truman said that the evidence against Oliver Hiss in that trial was false, but the man was clearly a spy for the Soviet Union. President Truman needs to take a more aggressive stance so that we can completely eliminate communism.
What do you think about the Rosenberg trial?
That trial is more along the lines of what I want to see, because two people who are a danger to our entire country were rightfully convicted. The Rosenbergs passed information about the atomic bomb to the Soviet Union, and that could have been disastrous. The conviction and execution of the Rosenbergs, even though people protested, is the kind of no-nonsense attitude we all need to adopt against communism. President Eisenhower was right to deny them clemency.
That's very interesting, Senator, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today.
It's my pleasure. We've got to spread the word.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator McCarthy later accused the U.S. Army of being too soft on communism. This led to his conviction for contempt of the Senate. His political career was destroyed, and 3 years later, Senator McCarthy died. Though his intentions were honorable, he eventually became too outlandish with his claims, and this eventually led to his downfall. Now, before we conclude our broadcast today on the Cold War, we are going to hear a few words from Mr. President Eisenhower himself, who is here in the studio. Gabria?
Thank you, Tina. Welcome, Mr. President. Thank you for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
My first question is about Sputnik. Sputnik was the first satellite launched into space by the Soviet Union. Can you please explain the Americans' response to this launch?
Well, first of all, it made all Americans panic because we were so complacent about our technical superiority. Americans were afraid of a possible attack from the Soviet Union with armed missiles. However, I had known that the missile gap was more of an illusion than real from the information gathered by high-altitude spy planes.
What did you do in response to Sputnik?
In 1958, Congress decided to create the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, also known as NASA. Its purpose was to coordinate research and development of missiles and spacecrafts because our missile development lagged behind the Soviet Union.
Were there any other programs created?
Also in 1958, Congress enacted the National Defense Education Act. This authorized federal grants for training in mathematics, science, and modern languages, as well as for student loans and fellowships.
The usage of high-altitude spy planes to gather info from the Soviet Union led to the U-2 incident. What action did you take after the U-2 summit planes were shot down?
After our plane was shot down by Soviet Unions for spying on them, I was worried about our pilot, Francis Gary Powers. I decided to take personal responsibility and justify the area spying on the ground of national security.
Okay, moving on to a slightly different topic. Can you please explain your Secretary of State duels on the containment policy?
State Secretary Dulles believed that the containment plan was expensive, ineffective, and needed the approval of the status quo. His idea was that instead of severing the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe and waiting for the communists to act before containing them, he believed that the United States should liberate the Europeans. In dealing with Soviet Union, he believed that U.S. should not focus so much on local defense power, but they should back up their local defense with the power of massive retaliation. This would make any nation think twice about attacking the U.S.
Can you explain Dulles' policy of brinkmanship?
Yes. This policy was Dulles' belief that to be aggressive enough about communism, nations sometimes had to reach the brink of nuclear war. But this was terrifying. He thought it was necessary in order to take a tough stand.
Thank you. Now, under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union had begun a sort of de-Stalinization period, but the results were not always positive. Can you address this?
Well, the Soviets relaxed their policy a little in the Eastern European-style nations. This led to independence movement, some were successful, while others weren't. For example, the movements in Poland won some independence by not cutting all ties to the USSR. However, in Hungary, in 1956, a moderate communist leader at the head of the government announced that Hungary would withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, which was a military alliance between Eastern European countries controlled by the USSR. This announcement led to the Soviets sending troops to Budapest, choosing a new leader, and executing the moderate communists. This is an example of an independent movement that unfortunately did not lead to moderation.
Mr. President, any final words you'd like to say? Anything that worries you?
I do want to caution the country and the government against the military-industrial complex and the influence it might have. This financial relationship between industry, the armed forces, and legislature could lead to misplaced power and corruption.
Thank you for your time, Mr. President.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Back to you, Tina.
Thank you, Gabria. We hope that today's special edition broadcast on the Cold War helped inform all of the American people of the dangers that a powerful Soviet Union could pose to our country as well as the rest of the world. Have a good night.